there we go, we've entered a dark and spooky place where old radios come to die. Ooh, rectifiers. Quite a sad looking speaker there. But probably still repairable. So that's the remains of an old 405 line television that I restored many years ago, but unfortunately when I moved house the removal man managed to smash the tube on the television set, so I think it might have been a bush, I can't exactly remember. And I can spot down there some large roller coasters for well, it was going to be a big high power tuner I was going to build back in the day again when I used to experiment with high power linear valve amplifiers. So a bit of a memory lane coming up here to this dark and distant cave. What is this? I have again got no idea. Oh, it's a Heath kit AM transceiver. I think I may have only bought this thing to rob the PA valves out of it, because I think they might be the same ones that go on my one of my Yaesu transceivers. I'm not sure, can't remember. Again, it's been in here about 20 years. Now I think I'm starting to sneak up on my prey for today, so we all need to just keep the noise down because we don't want to startle it. No, it's not the Trio. Everybody has one of these. If you don't believe me, go up to your loft, go to the back of it. Everybody has one of these Trio 9Rs lurking somewhere. You go upstairs, look under the bed, there will be one. Go back to the back of the shed, there's probably 2 or 3 in there. They certainly are a very ubiquitous receiver. They are everywhere. And actually, just as it happens, that's the first radio which I ever owned. Now we all need to be very quiet now because we don't want to startle it, because I can just see it there nestling in the undergrowth. You know what, looks like we're missing a speaker.
The witch knows the deep magic, but there is a magic deeper still which she has never known, for her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time.
Hey, Turkish Delight. Now I've got to admit, I can't exactly remember where I bought this radio, but certainly it's been in my possession for at least 20 years. And the only reason that I bought it is because I think I had another radio that I was restoring, and I wanted some parts off it, so I think that's probably why the speaker's gone, because when I actually did buy this, it was in such a poor state. It wasn't the kind of thing that you would ever consider restoring. I mean, it's got a few things which are not in its favour, which make it not that desirable, and probably the most important one is that it's a battery set, and let's face it, batteries are a pain in the arse. You can't exactly take a trip down to Rumbelows and go and buy another battery for these things, and yeah, that's a big problem. Of course, I think you've seen in one of my other videos, I did actually make a battery for a vintage radio, and you can do it, but it's a lot of work. So back in the day, to actually get this radio up and running and make a battery for it was really just more trouble and effort that I was prepared to put in. Even though this is the kind of radio that somebody would pay you to take away, you know, back in the day, nobody would have wanted this. I probably paid about £1 for it. In fact, I think I did pay about £1 for it. They just weren't wanted. But 20 years later, even radios that you wouldn't consider for restoration because they were in such a poor state, now they're becoming more viable projects. I mean, looking at this, I can actually see, you know, it's got one thing in its favour. It's actually got all the valves in it, which again, valves aren't necessarily expensive. People often worry when they're restoring valve radios, can I get the valves? The reality is most valves are still available on the second-hand market. Things like eBay are your friends, and you don't tend to pay, well, I say you don't pay a lot of money for a valve. Most valves will go between £10 and £15 unless it's something which has been made by nude virgins, which the audio crowd are into. All those audiophiles, they'll pay hundreds of pounds for match valves, but that's because they're idiots. So printed on the back of this fibre board, we've actually got some information here. So we've got that it's a Cossor battery receiver, and the model number is, for those playing at home, is the number 238. And it gives us some information about the batteries. And it does look like we need quite a complicated array of batteries here. I mean, they would have all probably been in one unit, but we need 120 volts. I think we need a 45 volt tapping. We need a -2 and a -9 volt tapping for the grid bias. So again, not exactly a very available battery, so we'll have to see what we can do about that. So if we just turn the radio around and have a look at the front of it. So you can see here we've got this control here which says increase on it. Well, that's a reaction control, and that basically tells me that this radio is not a superhet. It actually predates superhets. It's what they call a straight TRF receiver. And the TRF bit, of course, stands for tuned radio frequency. So it doesn't downshift to an intermediate frequency. What it actually does, it actually amplifies the raw RF as it is, and then rectifies it and amplifies it. So it's a very, very simple radio. Now, the date of this radio, well, there's nothing actually printed on it, and no information on that maker's plate, but just looking at the style of valves that we've got here, this envelope shape, this is probably anywhere between, I'm going to say it's probably around 1937 to early 40s. So we really are looking at a very early radio set here. So we've got some of the original wiring sticking out the back of the radio here, and it's got these lovely little tags on it. So this one says "Here's Earth." Can I just give that a wipe without rubbing the lettering off? That's always a problem. You give something a wipe and the lettering comes off of it. But you see that says Earth on it. That's lovely, isn't it? And there's another one here. So this red wire says Ariel on it. And of course that goes into the connectors on the back here, which has got E for Earth and A for Aerial. And just continuing our stroll along the back of this radio, we've also got what looks like a broken bulb. I'll just unscrew that. So I'm sure you'll agree that does look like a broken bulb, and you probably won't be surprised to know that's exactly what it is. This is a bulb and it's got the end broken off it. I'll just screw that back in there for now. Now this bulb that's screwed into the back of the chassis, it's not actually used as a light bulb, it's actually what they call a fuse bulb. So it was there to protect the radio if somebody plugged in the HT battery incorrectly. And then at the far end of the chassis you've got basically L and S, which would be for an external loudspeaker. Now I'm not sure, we've got some PU connections here at the other end, and I think PU was Was that the same as Graham? Is that just like an audio line in? I think it perhaps was, I'm not certain though. So we've also got a big bunch of really horrible rubber wiring, and the rubber wiring has, well, of course it's very old. It's coming up for 100 years old, this wiring, and it's gone a horrible black colour, and it's gone very, very brittle. So actually some of these wires are still flexible, but a lot of the like the red wire there, for example, I say it is a red wire underneath all the filth. It's just become very, very brittle, and all the insulation's just flaking off it. So I actually like to keep as much of the original wiring wherever I can on a valve radio, because it is part of it. But yeah, that's just too far gone, so we're going to have to try and replace that. Got some more blue wires hanging down there. I'm guessing that they might have been the speaker connections, but I'm not sure. Right, well, I don't really think we can do much more with this while the chassis remains inside the woodwork. So let's go ahead and take that out. But before I do anything, obviously one of the most precious things in this radio is these valves. So what we'll do is we will have them out. And it looks like the previous owner of this radio maybe had some problems with some valves working loose, and I can see here he's actually just used some twine, and he's actually tied the valve in. So I think we're just going to have to undo him from his constraints. So I've actually unscrewed this from the valve top cap, and the reason I've unscrewed it is I can feel that this is loose, the top of this valve, and probably what's happening under here is this plastic cap would have been secured to the top of the valve, and probably over the last 50 years the glue has gone, and now that's loose. But if we play around with this too much, we're going to end up snapping the top wire off the valve, and if we do that, it's useless. So somebody's actually gone to the trouble of tying this down. You can see they've tied it down there, and yeah, that's to secure this top cap. All I'm actually going to do is, yeah, there's lots of ways of repairing this. Some people will frown on it. I'm just going to clean the valve off, and I'm going to put some araldite under it, and that's good enough. So just holding the top cap of the valve very tightly, I've just put a little bit of lube on here, and I'm very carefully just working out the top cap connection. So there we go, there's the top cap connection out. Now, I did explain earlier why this radio has remained unrestored for the last, well, very many years, and again, a lot of it has to do with the batteries, and that, you know, battery sets are just a pain in the arse, really. But I was actually just thinking the other day that it's been a while since I've looked at a valve radio, and I've got to admit that long Cobra series of CBs, as much as I'm interested in the CB radios, it's fair to say that I was even starting to bore myself. So I don't know what you guys thought of it all. So I just thought I need a bit of a change from CBs and stuff like that. We will come back to them, but I just wanted to do something else. Now, I thought these knobs would put up more of a fight than this, but having said that, I'm sure the last one will be a swine. Okay, seems alright that actually. We'll take the screws completely out of them and give them a clean in a bit. We need actually a very thin bladed screwdriver to fit that. If we get anything thin enough. So just look at this radio, I'm just taking it apart now. It's got one of those very fine and coarse tuning controls on it. Right, okay, we got that out. Oh. Oh, it looks like somebody's actually already undone all the screws on this for me. Well, we can withdraw this radio. We've actually got to just undo the scale because it's actually screwed to the woodwork. That's caught me out before. Oh, come on.
Can you hear me, Mother?
Right, I found some free parts, so this looks as though it would have been the bezel that would have gone round the front of the tuning dial, and that looks as though it was a lovely kind of poo brown colour. Nice. So, first inspection of the chassis, what can we see? Well, we can see some nice tuning cans, we can see a little bit of surface rust, but I don't think that's really too bad at all. I'm kind of thinking just before we do any damage to this tuning scale, we better have this off, haven't we? So I'm just looking at the condition of this wave change switch, and yeah, it's in pretty poor state, but normally these will clean up. You can see that it's all green with this this verdigris material. So we'll probably strip all this out. You can actually take these out and clean them. So normally at this stage what I would do is probably just go ahead and maybe change a couple of the coupling capacitors and just go ahead, put a bit of power on it and see if we had any crackle or hum. You know, make sure the transformer and the rectifier valves and stuff like that was good. But you know, we haven't actually got a transformer and we haven't got a rectifier, and I haven't actually got a power supply that'll run this, so we're going to have to think about how we can do that. Now I do love looking at these old radio dials. You can see all these old stations, like we've got Moscow here, and Moscow, Radio Luxembourg, Droitwich, Deutschland, Munich, Leipzig, London Regular, Hamburg, National Broadcast, Radio Normandy and Frankfurt, all marked on the dial here. They're great, aren't they? Don't you just love that? So as we mentioned earlier, we're definitely going to have to do something with this wave change switch. Now it's not just a wave change switch, it's actually the on and off control as well. So we're going to have to clean all this verdigris off here, because it's never going to work with all that on. don't know if you can see, we've got these lovely old dog bone style resistors on here again, just another sign that this is a very early receiver. And you can probably also see that most of the wiring on here is kind of done point to point. There's no tag strip or anything like that, and it uses this quite heavy gauge, but a lot of this wiring in here, it's not even insulated. What I'm going to do is I'm going to carry on cleaning these because they really are quite dirty, especially where they've been in contact with the wiper. It's kind of corroded and eaten into the fingers here. So I'm going to carry on cleaning that and I'll bring it back when you're done. Well, for the last couple of days I've mainly been living off these Fry's chocolate creams. Now, I seem to remember back in the day they used to come in a paper wrapper with silver foil around them, and there's always something very luxurious, something very upper class about tucking into one of these Fry's chocolate creams. Now, does anybody remember, was the white filling inside kind of a minty flavour? Because the stuff in these modern ones doesn't seem minty, it just seems to be like white and sugary. Not quite what I remember. This would have been the battery connection, I think. As you can see, it's actually got quite a lot of wires on here. So we're going to have to try to replace that with something. Well, you can see that I've gone ahead and I've replaced the this wave change switch. I reinstalled it, and both the end points, the pivot points, I went ahead and I put a dab of grease on there and I rubbed some of the rust off. I gave these fingers, these connection fingers, I gave them a really good clean, and I also gave these little jumper bars which actually press against the fingers. You can see one there. If you can turn it, if you see, if I turn this, the way it works is this this wiper shorts between the two bars, and that's how you get the connection. So if I just turn this band select switch, what you'll see is it almost looks like a bent staple. What you'll find is that this will actually rotate and it'll come in contact, and it shorts out this pair of contacts here. So there we go, you can see the action there. Very simple, kind of crude in its construction, but really not a lot to go wrong with it. I say there's not a lot to go wrong with it, but what can sometimes happen is these are kind of mounted on like a rubber material, and again it just degrades over 50-60 years. Sometimes this rubber just falls apart and the staples fall out, and it's very hard to repair. But this one does seem okay, so no problems with that. I think I said earlier that this radio is what they call a TRF, which is tuned radio frequency. So it's not a super het receiver. It doesn't do any down conversion. It actually takes in the RF signal and it actually amplifies it at the RF frequency. It doesn't down convert it. It's kind of a very old-fashioned way of doing it. It's the first way of doing it, really. And I'm guessing that really they came up with this before they came up with oscillators and frequency mixing and all that good stuff. I mean, there's only 3 valves in this radio, and the valves are nothing exciting. They are just very basic amplifier valves. They're not doing anything very exciting. But yeah, you will find on these TRF sets, you'll find a reaction control. And what a reaction control is, it's actually a form of positive feedback. It actually takes a sample of the RF and it feeds it back into the input, and the positive feedback produces amplification. It was a bit of a kind of a double-edged sword, because if you actually don't have the reaction control set just right, well, if you don't have it set correctly, 2 things will happen. One, the radio won't be too sensitive, won't be sensitive enough. But if you actually have it set turned on too far, what will actually happen is the radio will go into oscillation and it will actually become a transmitter. And it was a real problem again back in the 1930s. If you went to the cinema, you would probably see the equivalent of the the publication information films, and they would be saying, beware of the nuisance of the reaction control, and they'd show some guy fiddling with his reaction control knob like that. And what it would do is it would actually turn your radio receiver in your living room, it'd actually turn it into a transmitter, and that could be picked up by all your neighbours, and you could actually block out reception for other people. So it was a real issue to get this reaction control set precisely. So the other thing I've done while you're away, I did just take some arrow dye and I've just dribbled it around the top of this valve just to secure the top cap, the top electrode, because if you actually break this off the top of the valve, I'm afraid it is just game over then. So hopefully we managed to resurrect this valve. We managed to repair it in time before the actual top electrode broke off, hopefully. My experience in valves is that generally they are good. Even though I've restored quite a lot of valve receivers, typically the valves don't cause you a problem. I'm not saying that's never the case, but typically a valve receiver, when you get it out of hibernation like this, it will typically work with the valves it's got in it. I also wanted to mention a tip when working on these radios is, you can see we've got the main tuning condenser here, and I've got it wound out at the moment, and you can see that the plates, the plate gangs on the capacitor, they're exposed. So if you are working on a radio, make sure you actually just wind the vanes of the variable capacitor, wind it all the way in, because it's much less prone to damage. And if these capacitor plates start touching each other, you have all sorts of problems, and they can be an absolute mare to try to correct and put right. It can be a near impossibility. So yeah, if you're going to be turning the radio over or working on it, or even when you're taking it out of the chassis, the first thing you should do is you should wind these fully in to give them a bit of protection. Now, amazingly enough, even though this radio isn't far off 100 years old, I was actually able to download the actual service information from it. Now, these radios are so simple, you don't really need a circuit diagram, but it's very nice to have one, isn't it? And yeah, we've got one here. But what is a real pain is all these battery connections. So you can see that, well, let's have a look at them. There is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 connections. So the top connection here we've got, that's the screen grid connection, which requires 45 volts. We've then got the main HT, our B+, which is 120 volts. We've then got our minus HT, and then we've got GB. We've then got our GB plus. Alright, GB plus, grid bias. So we've got a grid bias connection, a low tension, that's low tension negative, low tension positive. Now the low tension, that's a heater supply, that's a filament on the valves. And then we've got these grid bias. So we need a minus 4.5 volt grid bias, and we need a minus 9 volt grid bias. So that is going to be a bit of a bugger to try to set up, isn't it? Now, I always think that working on valve radios is an absolute pleasure compared with working on printed circuit boards and stuff like that, especially a valve radio like this one that really is very simple. Some of them can be quite complicated with tag strips on top of tag strips, and you know, they can be very difficult to get the components, but this one is relatively easy. So all I'm actually going to do is, we've got a circuit diagram here, and we've actually got a list of resistor values, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to take a highlighter pen, and I'm going to go through all these resistor values, and I'm going to check them. And it's quite likely that a lot of these resistors will have gone high, because that's the natural kind of failure, well, not failure mode, it's the way that these age. As these get age, they tend to go high in resistance. So the first one we're going to look at is this one here, which is it's a grid bias resistor for the primary, well, the incoming RF amplifier, and according to the data sheet here, it should be 2 meg. Now, some of you might not have seen this style of resistor before. They're actually called dog bone resistors, because I guess they've got, maybe they look like a bit of a bone shape if you remember the old Dennis the Menace and Gnasher cartoons, a dog bone. Let me see if I can bring you in a bit so you can see it a bit more closely. So here's our dog bone resistor, and the value of this resistor is 2 megohm. Now, you might see that the markings on here, you might not be familiar with them. Well, the way that you read these is a way of remembering it, and what you've got to remember is the word bed. B-E-D. So the way you actually read the colours off these is you look at the body, and then you look at the end, and then you look at the dot, which is the dot of colour in the centre. So body, end and dot. So the body colour here is red, so obviously that's 2. The end is black, so that's a 0. And then we look at the dot, which is green, which is 5. And if you put them together, that makes up, of course, 2 meg. So in the future, when you're trying to read the colour codes off these resistors, you only have to remember BED, bed.